Thank you again, everyone, for joining in. I think this is a very, very exciting topic of conversation, something that affects a lot of people and affects data security, not just from an organization perspective, but from a country perspective. Just as a couple quick housekeeping items, this session is being recorded, and we're going to be making it available online afterwards for anybody to come back and review what we've seen, or even share it with others within your organization. Another housekeeping item is there is a question section within the webinar itself. For the sake of time, we're going to try to get through all of the content, but if you can try to put your questions into the question section, then what we'll do is try to review those at the end. Otherwise, we can follow up with each of you directly afterwards to go through it. And on that note, I'm very excited to mention that I'm joined today by two experts within their respective spaces, David Broussard and Matt Henson. David joins us from Axiomatics as the Chief Technology Officer, and he's got experience leading the design and development of Salesforce's identity offering, including customer identity and access management, commonly referred to as CIAM. He is a founding member of ID Pro, a co-author of the OASIS XACML standard, and an expert on standard-based authorization as part of an overall identity and access management implementation. Matt Henson has spent his entire career working the intersection between global commerce, export regulations, and information technology. He specializes in the automation of trade compliance process and controls in IT networks, systems, and data. Today, Matt uses this expertise to help organizations and companies alike implement data safeguarding and compliant release capabilities. Thank you both for joining. And on that, David, I will hand it over to you, sir.
Thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. What an intro, Matt. I really want to meet those guys. All right, let's get started. So I personally wear more of an authorization hat than a ZT hat. I think, Matt, good morning, Matt, forgot to say hi. I think you wear more of a ZT hat than an authorization hat. We complement each other really well. I'm going to take you through the authorization story first, and then Matt will dive deeper into how that impacts Zero Trust and what they've been working on. So if we look at authorization, historically, a little bit like authentication before authorization, it was implemented, it still is implemented oftentimes in each and every single app that the business needs to have. And when you do that, you end up with something called siloed authorization. Every time I use that expression, I'm thinking of the Midwest with all these corn silos and grain silos. It's pretty much that. And the challenge with the silos is that you have very, very poor visibility into what authorization is being implemented everywhere overall consistently, because you have one silo doing one piece of authorization here, you have another silo doing another piece of authorization there. They might be using different technologies, they might not, they're hard to reconcile because they're using these different technologies, and you end up in between those silos with authorization gaps. You might also end up, by the way, with authorization inconsistencies and worse, violations of segregation of duty, because you simply don't know what authorization is here, what authorization in there is there, and how it correlates. And that's a big challenge, and that has been a big challenge for the past 15 years. Now, when we look at that through the lens of Zero Trust, where the idea is we never trust anyone, we always want to verify, the existing authorization, static authorization, if you will, is no longer enough. We need to move to a model where we bring down those silos, where we bring visibility, expressibility across the landscape so that you can actually build your Zero Trust strategy. And if we compare what we have today with static authorization versus the new model that we propose, dynamic authorization, all we really want to do is make authorization go down the same path identity and authentication has. If you go back 15 years, you had authentication and identity silos. Today, we've more or less, at least on the employee identity side, we've matured our authentication and identity strategy to have one single identity store. And these are actually important. So we need to have a sound identity foundation, we need to have unified identities. We need to have a proper IAG process, and we need to have a healthy RBAC foundation in order to start building dynamic authorization. And in dynamic authorization, there's really two parts that come into play. On the one hand is identifying the attributes that will be part of the decision making, if you will, determining what parameters or attributes, not just of the user, by the way, not just of the client, but also of the things you want to get access to, identifying which attributes matter. And we'll see later how zero trust and all the technology around zero trust gives us a whole new slew of attributes to actually consider an authorization. And then the second piece, the what, I'm kind of reading right to left today, is the policies. Bringing the policies together, bringing the attributes together in policies to express what can and cannot be done. Okay, we use a standard called Alpha at Axiomatics, the abbreviated language for authorization. There's a couple other standards out there like Open Policy Agent, like CEDAR. These are great languages to start building your dynamic authorization strategy. If we paint ABAC and dynamic authorization into the evolution of zero trust, if we go back to the pre-2014, the pre-2010 days, there is no integration whatsoever. Authentication, like I said, is done ad hoc on a per application basis. It's probably a whole lot of passwords hiding in application code. And little by little, we realize, well, hang on a minute, we've got to clean up that authentication mess. We have great technologies like the trusty SAML, but more importantly, things like OAuth, OpenID Connect, great products like Ping and Okta that solve the authentication challenge, but kind of stop short of going the step further, the second level, which is contextual access, where we want to bring in attribute-based access control policies, ABAC policies, using not just who you are as an individual, but what it is you want to do and what you want to do it on, and metadata about the resources you're trying to get access to. That enables, of course, fine-grained authorization. That enables authorization at scale as well, and it brings down the silos I mentioned earlier. And then going further in the zero trust direction, when we look at all of the information that ZT can give us, it introduces risk. It introduces the notion of continuous authorization, whereby every time you attempt an access, no matter the access, we will verify that you're supposed to and you're allowed to do it. And you might ask, well, what's in it for me? I mean, my authorization, I don't even think about it. It's there, it works. You say silos, so what? I don't care. The application owners deal with it. Yeah, but no. The problem with that is it prevents you from being compliant. I've heard customers tell me, whenever we need to prove compliance with a piece of legislation XYZ or internal business requirement, we literally just print the code that does the authorization check in each and every app and give it to the auditors, and they're happy with that. That's not a good answer. You can't give your auditors a screenshot of Python here, a screenshot of Java there, or maybe a list of roles that you have within your IDP. That's just not good enough. But I don't just want to play FUD here. I don't want to play the scaremonger. There's also something in it for everyone, including the developers, and that's the accelerated pace with which you can develop. Just think about it. If you're building a net new app, say you want to do a cab hailing app, say an Uber, if you will, if you have to worry about the authentication and the authorization, then you're wasting cycles on something that is not your core business, right? Instead, you really should be working on how to make the user experience, the right experience better, and then just delegate the authentication authorization to the proper frameworks, the proper tooling, the proper vendors. There's also a dimension of authorization. One of the thoughts that our customers tell us is, oh, well, if we start doing this dynamic authorization, this externalized authorization, surely it's going to be way slower. And my answer is no, it might, but the real truth is you just don't know what the cost of authorization is in your app today. When you decouple the authorization from the app, when you bring down those silos, you make authorization visible, you make the performance or lack of performance visible, and that gives you an opportunity to make your apps perform way better. And then the last item here is focusing on core competencies. That's really related to the pace of innovation as well. As let your business do what it does best. Let us help you do authorization and security. And that brings us to a concept that is really near and dear to me, which is what we call orchestrated authorization. the whole idea that we're going to help you drive authorization in your landscape, in your apps, in your services, and it doesn't matter whether it's a cloud app, whether it's a human, whether it's a database, and so forth. We will do that, and then we'll take attributes from wherever they live, we'll tie them together into the policies that will define the authorization roles, if you will, and then we'll push those policies out and enforce those policies consistently. And that enables things like, first of all, making developers more efficient, making sure that you're compliant with regulations, and then enabling new use cases that you hadn't thought of before. If we look at it from a product perspective, what we do is deliver first and foremost, and point number 2, a world-class authorization service. And then around that, if you look at the other points, we have the supporting services, the enforcement points to apply authorization where it matters, the information points to grab those attributes from the sources, the policy modeling to help you, either the developer or the business analyst, create those policies in an efficient way. And then finally, the reporting and the analytics to be able to prove your compliance, to be able to prove who has had access and who did what, not just what they can do, what can they do. I also like to tie authorization back into the identity side of things within Zero Trust. Because authentication has matured more quickly than authorization, a lot of ZT is based on who you are and verifying who you are all the time. That is great for us because now we can leverage that identity information and we can extend that into richer policies that look at the other dimensions, the other parameters, like I mentioned. And one other side effect, by the way, is that you don't just have to do authorization in your apps. I've been talking a lot about apps, it's where I typically focus the most, but actually you can expand beyond just applications and you can go across the stack. And if you think about the ISO stack, you can go all over your users, your network applications, your data, your devices, your workloads, and so on and so forth to apply authorization consistently there, and you can consume attributes from those layers as well. And before I hand it over to Matt, just to give you an example, this is some of the points we integrate with. You'll see that some of them are application layers, some of them are API layers, some of them are a governance layer, but we can connect with all these. There is, in principle, no limit to where we can integrate when you externalize authorization. And that's one of the coolest things that we enable, and that's why we fit so well into a Zero Trust story, because you can choose where authorization makes sense and you can choose to plug in at the right layer at the right level. And with that being said, Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you. And I think I'm making Krishna presenter. Is that correct?
I'll be presenter initially.
Okay, I'll make you the presenter then.
Awesome. And we will toggle back and forth. We're really going to test.
Yeah, actually, you already
to swap presenters here.
Yeah, I think you could just take control from me.
All right, I think that's sharing my screen. See these slides?
You can see PowerPoint.
Awesome. All right, very good. Let me minimize that screen there. Oh, get back to where I was. So I've titled this this section Zero Trust, the key to unlocking compliant data flows. So David, thanks for that overview. Right, we're essentially going to be talking about a type of authorization called an export authorization today, and how that's leveraged within Zero Trust to enable these compliant data flows. Just before I get started here, there are topics that we'll be discussing. Of course, Zero Trust for ECI, CY overlap. I do a lot of writing on LinkedIn. I encourage you to search for these topics and read up if you're looking for more information. Also today, we may not get to all questions. There may be questions that folks are just too shy to ask, or maybe this isn't the right, an open forum's not the right place to ask the question. So this is a link here, and if somebody could take that and actually maybe paste that out in the chat here before the end of the session, so everybody can take that. That'll provide you access to my calendar, and we can book some time to go deeper. Then we will be sending out an encrypted copy of the presentation. You'll actually see some of this encryption in our demo today. So David's already given the introduction to authorization from a Zero Trust perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit at first about the Defense Industrial Base compliance challenges And then compliant release for export controlled information. So what is this term compliant release? What is ECI? We'll explain both of those today. And then zero trust for ECI, which is really how you perform compliant release for the export controlled information. So we'll jump into that, and then we'll show a couple quick demos, then we'll do Q&A and wrap up. So defense industrial base challenges, they really stem from something I refer to as DIB compliance debt and the known unknowns. It's unknown data in unknown locations, unknown users who can access, unknown users who are accessing, unknown transfers and unknown retransfers of unknown data to unknown users, and ultimately, is any of this authorized, right? And if you look at ITAR consent agreements, this is essentially what causes them. If you boil them down from an IT perspective, it's the known unknowns and whether or not any of these things are authorized. So from a bottom line perspective, the DIB must implement capabilities to identify, control, track, and remediate ECI. So it all starts with the identification. You have to be able to tag and mark for safeguarding and compliant release. We're going to talk about those terms here in the next slide or so, and we'll actually demonstrate some of this tagging and marking here in a couple slides as well. From control tracking and remediation perspective, it's all about location access, transfer, and retransfer controls, and we'll touch on each one of these today. Now, I mentioned ECI, but the great news is the same capabilities that are used to identify, control, and track and remediate ECI can be used for any type of information, right? It's not just an ECI use case. So what is ECI? Well, it's an umbrella term used to describe information subject to any country's regulations. Now, generally, this is what it is. I'm not going to read this to you. But to summarize, it's technical IP. It's owned by you, it's owned by your supplier, it's owned by your customer, maybe it's owned by the government, right? And if that information is owned by the government, that ECI, there could be CUI overlap, right? So, things like controlled technical information, export controlled information, and export controlled research. Now, if you look at the ECI CUI overlap, and we have to talk about this because there's such a push right now on the CMMC side, right? So you have controlled and classified information that basically you get a requirement, a clause 7012 within the DFARS that flows down in your contract, and now you have unstructured and structured CUI that you have to safeguard. And then those requirements also flow down throughout the supply chain, and as the data flows down as well. Now, on the export control side, if we're looking, just at the DFARS reference here, we've been dealing with this for a long, long time, right? The 2048, it's been around for decades. And the interesting thing to note here is that the export regulations apply whether or not you have a DFARS contract, right? This is just reinforcing the fact that you have to comply with these regulations if you do get a DFARS contract. But if you have ECI, you have ECI, and the ITAR and EAR, if you're in the US, are going to apply to that information. Now, whether you're dealing with CUI or ECI, it's the same data challenges, right? It's all about safeguarding and compliant release. Now, from a CUI perspective, right, the big CMMC focus is on safeguarding. I mean, it's right in the 7012 heading, right? The focus is on safeguarding. But the entire reason that trade compliance exists, our purpose, is to enable compliant release of this information with our international partners. Now, if you look at export compliance, there are two approaches, right? The first approach is export compliance through export prevention. You prevent unauthorized exports by preventing all exports. So, for example, we lock this data down to US person-only access, right? The second approach is export enablement. We ensure that all exports are validated against prior approvals, records are kept, and reports are filed. So, for example, the export's authorized under a valid license. From the ECI perspective, this is the difference between safeguarding and compliant release. Now, with most of the security folks focused on safeguarding, they typically have a very coarse grained approach, right, to safeguarding. They may be tagging data as restricted or something like that, and using that coarse grained tag to lock the data down. But when we're doing compliant release, right? It's all about what information do we need to make an accurate, timely decision, and can we supply that? And so from a safeguarding perspective, when we talk about data identification, we really need to know two things. Is it ECI, and what's its country of control? If I have US ECI, I can lock down the US locations, US persons, that sort of thing. But if we want to compliantly release that information, if we want to export it, we need to know some additional detail. We need to know its jurisdiction, we need to know its classification. Ultimately, we need to know its export authorization. And these data tagging and marking requirements really apply to both your unstructured and structured data. So let's take a quick break here and let's do a demo what I mean by this metadata tagging. So this is a product here that I'm demonstrating. This is called a product called Titus, and this provides a user interface that allows you to tag and mark your data. So as we talked about earlier, if I say it is ECI, right, I'm going to need to know its country of control, and that may be all that I need to apply, right? We're not going to export this data. I don't know it's going to be exported. We're just going to tag it for safeguarding. Now, if I want to compliantly release that information, I might need to know a little bit more information about it, right? Including all the way down to its export authorization. And maybe if I'm the US, I'm sending it to my sister company in Canada, you know, they've got regulations too, and maybe they need to tag it as well, right? So we have to have a country and regime agnostic approach to that, and that's what's built into our compliance data science and what we leverage in the Zero Trust. Now, we talked about the ECI CUI overlap, right? If this information is ECI and also CUI, well, I know that these are the definitions, right, of ECI. Basically, when we look at the CUI designations, and perhaps we're going to export this. So this is going to be rel 2, and oh, a second. My apologies here. If I can type in the field, right? Perhaps we're going to release it to USA and Canada, right? And now what I have on this file, I have my visual markings that are required for the regulations, and I also get the metadata tags, which is extremely important. We're going to leverage these metadata tags later in the demo. Our Zero Trust model is actually feeding off of these. So you'll see here all the metadata tags. Now, what you saw there, fairly complex from a tagging standpoint, but if I know what I'm wanting to tag, I can also come in and make that selection and easily tag this information. And we'll be showing an innovative way of tagging here in a few minutes as well. All right. So when we're talking about Zero Trust and we're focused on the compliant release use case, we really have to make a change in mindset from one of, hey, let's lock it down, let's safeguard it, to one of, let's maximize compliant global trade. How do we do that? And if we focus on this and enable it, the domestic collaboration, maximizing the domestic collaboration is simply a byproduct, right? So in the Zero Trust model, everything requires an authorization. So if you think about the business as a big data pipeline, and we have to enable these compliant data flows, instead of locking data down to US persons only, right? The Zero Trust mindset flips that model on its head and said, well, actually what we're doing is we're enabling domestic collaboration where ECI is true, because there's going to be an authorization for it, right? We're also enabling international collaboration where ECI is false, right? And then there's going to be that data that's going to be released under prior approval, and there's going to be a bunch of stuff that isn't tagged correctly. We don't have the information to make an accurate and timely decision, therefore the transaction must be blocked, right? And our objective from a trade compliance standpoint is to grow what's released under prior approval over time, thus maximizing compliant global trade. So what is compliant release of ECI? Well, I talked about the prior approval concept. I'm not going to read the slide to you, but essentially what you have to understand about this is unless you have an explicit authorization from the government, either encoded in the regulations as an exemption or exception, or you've gone to them for a license, right? You can't export compliantly, right? You have to have an authorization in order to do that. So this prior approval concept is really important. So how is a compliant release decision made? Well, you've got business transactions, and there are certain things that we have to know about those transactions. You know, what objects are involved, what entities are involved, what individuals are involved. And those things come together in a prior approval match. Records are kept and reports are filed, right? So how is this prior approval match made, right? What is going into this? So if we flip this model on its head and we put the transactional control point at the top, we see that we've got our objects, our entities, and our individuals, and we have our attributes, right? So what information is required for accurate and timely decisions has to be modeled out in your data, right? In your object, your entity, and your individual records. So these transactional attributes are made available to decision makers who have access to an export authorization store, which essentially has the same model in it. And traditionally, there's been someone out here saying, okay, is there a match? Is this authorized, right? And that's traditionally how trade compliance is done within an organization. It's a three-way match, right? If anything is off in any one of the attributes, that transaction has to be blocked, right? It has to be blocked, or if we're missing certain attributes, it has to be blocked, right? Certain information we don't know, we can't make a decision without it. And the real objective here, right, is what we're talking about is automating the prior approval match and managing by exception, or what we call automated red light, green light. Now, this has been done for decades with the product and other products like it, right? The product I'll highlight here is SAP's Global Trade Services product. And essentially, it's facilitating millions and millions and millions of automated transactions around the world every day, right? With this type of approach for tangible exports, right? Physical shipments. So this brings us to zero trust for ECI, because what zero trust is, it's just a fancy new IT slang for the capabilities to automate that decision for data, right? And so from a zero trust perspective, you have your safeguarding and compliant release rule sets, right? And these rule sets are going to process attributes that they receive. There are important attributes that come from that we have to know again about our users, our data, and our export authorizations. So with that information, we can go out and start making accurate and timely decisions and automating those. From a zero trust, and this is a simplified architecture, there are really two components within this model. There's a policy decision point, right, that has all your rules. It also has your export authorizations and your identity attributes of your people, right? The rules process and make decisions. All those decisions are logged, right? And typically these systems are integrated with a SIEM system to look for security events. Our PDP is powered by Axiomatics. We've built our version, right, specifically for this export authorization use case. So you've got your policy decision point out there. Well, you also have your business apps, and this is what David was talking about, right? Most people are focused on this, and you got your users and your data within those applications. And then what happens is you deploy a policy enforcement point, right? Say, hey, this particular transaction, this is where we want to do our authorization because it's going to potentially provide access to export controlled information. So the policy enforcement point has two jobs. It intercepts the transaction and it passes the information, the user and the data attributes, over to the PDP, right? So that's job one. Job two is enforcing the decision, either allow or deny decision that is returned from the policy decision point, right? So that's what's happening within the policy enforcement point. And this is how we automate red light, green light for data. This model is scalable, right? So this is what Dave was talking about. Like, hey, if you get a new export authorization in and you've got to collaborate in Jira and Windchill and maybe there's going to be other apps that the engineering and manufacturing community are using to collaborate internationally on those programs, right? You can have a single window in a single place that you can enforce your controls on in those multiple applications. So demonstration overview here, quick time check, doing good. All right, so we talked about this a slide or two ago, and so some of the solutions that we're going to see demonstrated, obviously Axiomatics with the PDP, But the first demonstration we're going to look at is attribute-based access controls. And so from an identity perspective, right, the identity attributes will be provided by your company's identity services, again, like Ping, Okta, Active Directory, et cetera. And then for the export authorization store, you'll see a product that TC Engine developed, we call the authorization engine, and this product decomposes export authorizations into the machine actionable attributes and feeds those into the authorization store. So we'll quickly show high level there overview, because as we introduce that authorization, it's going to impact who can and cannot access information. And then from a data perspective, right, we're using essentially Titus, and you'll see our tagging engine at work today, which provides a drag and tag capability, simplified user experience, and that's providing the file metadata tag that you will see in the demo. So that'll be demo 1. And then demo 2, we're going to do attribute-based transfer controls, right? And so within our tagging engine, we've also deployed a PEP. And as users say, hey, I've got this data that I want to export, they're going to drag and drop it on an export authorization line item that they've been approved to use. We're going to get the metadata tags that are required for compliant release, right? And then as they want to share that with users, we're going to do the allow or deny decision. Those that are allowed are going to be encrypted with Vera, a product that's does 256-bit end-to-end encryption, which allows us to take advantage of 120.54a5 and 120.50 within the ITAR. And Vera allows us to secure, track, audit, and revoke access and all activities to data once it leaves our security boundary. So when you start looking at, retransfer controls, once the data has left your boundary, the only way you can do that is through encryption. And then that encrypted data is then provided to the recipient. And then finally, we'll look at some dashboards, some insights, which is where it's all at, right? Getting visibility into what's actually happening with your information. So with that, we're going to shift over into the demo. And Krishna, I think you can steal the share from me here, and I'll kind of narrate as you go there.
That was great, by the way, Matt. And maybe just before or while Krishna's getting that up, one of the big takeaways that I got out of your presentation there, what I really like to see is the fact that this isn't about locking everything down. It's not about getting in the way of business. It's about enabling the business to safely control how information is shared, ensuring that only the right person has access at the right time under the right scenarios. Basically leveraging the attributes that you mentioned. David, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Matt. I think security authentication authorization for the longest time has seen as a disabler, like it's something you have to do. You don't really want to do it, but actually today flip that around, and if you look at, say, the medical sector, it used to be that your medical records would be at the doctor's office. Partly because IT did not exist back then, but also because that was the most secure. No one's gonna break into the office at scale, right? Only the local thieves, right? Which is bad enough. But now you have an opportunity to actually put them online. And if you put them online, what it means is that you, the patient, can get access. You, the patient, can share them with the pharmacist, with maybe a specialist doctor on the other side of the country. So there's a whole lot of opportunities. Maybe researchers can get access to anonymized data and do more research. So yeah, it creates a whole lot of opportunities. It's just a matter of having the right controls around it to make sure that only the right people get access to the right data for the right circumstances.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things we're going to see, right? Everybody's rushing to safeguarding. They're going into these environments that are basically designed for safeguarding, with very perhaps a complete unawareness that compliant release is something that needs to take place in those environments to even happen, right? And I think you're going to see a huge pendulum swing away from essentially a leapfrog, right? We need a leapfrog capabilities in the defense industrial base right over CMMC into zero trust, because if we just lock the data down and it's very difficult to collaborate and share that information, it's like putting a data flow tourniquet the international limbs that you have, right? And so our international collaboration, I mean, we're entering a point where it's more important than ever that we be able to collaborate with our allies internationally. And that's really, really difficult to do if you've only got safeguarding tools and a safeguarding mindset and a safeguarding approach. So with that, what Krishna has pulled up here, Krishna Prasad is our CTO, phenomenal technologist. We built this tool. This is, again, the authorization engine. And what this does, you drag and drop an authorization in it. It's country and regime agnostic. It extracts essentially the attributes that are required to perform those downstream decisions. So we'll be coming back to this. We'll be saving this data here in a few minutes. But again, like things like parties, provisos, products, the line items, all that type of stuff get pulled across in this application. So Krishna, let's pull up red light, green light. So we refer to this as red light, green light, pretty simple, right? But essentially what this is an application that we built to start looking at file shares in SharePoint and looking at their content. So you're gonna see some data that's being pulled in here. This is being applied by Titus, right? So these columns with their attributes. And then you'll see the red light, green light there. That is a decision returned by Axiomatics based on the classification of the data, based on the user attributes, and also based on the authorization attributes. So you'll see here we've got a couple of greens down below. These are all these are both non-ECI, right? So ECI no. And you'll see over there to the right, data's non-ECI, no export authorization is necessary, right? So those are both approved. Now you'll see 3 up at the top here where Krishna does not have access because he is not there's not an authorization, and that's clearly stated in the reason code that's being returned from Axiomatics. So Krishna, let's go in and let's save that export authorization. So within this scenario, Krishna is an Indian national working in India for, I believe, EFG company. I can't remember the exact scenario, but working for a company that's on one of these authorizations. So Krishna saved that. It's now introduced into our Axiomatics authorization store. So Krishna, if you'll refresh. So this is going out. It's doing all the analytics on these files, and it's evaluating those against the rule sets and the export authorization. So now you'll see here at the top, Krishna's now authorized, so user access is permitted. It's got the export authorization ID in there. And you still see there's some information within this view that Krishna does not have access to. One of the questions we get a lot of time is, hey, what if someone leaves? What if someone what if someone moves, right? So Krishna, why don't we do this? Why don't we swap? Let's change out your identity, your country, residency country on the back end. Let's change it from India to Canada. Refresh there. So now Krishna's country is updated, right? And basically it comes back and it says, hey, the Canada is not authorized on this particular authorization, right? So the supplier location is India. So Krishna, let's go ahead and switch that back so that we can demo the next piece here as well. All right, toggles it back to India. Now he's authorized again. Okay. All right, so that's sort of the first use case here. Now let's move to attribute-based transfer control. So Krishna, will you pull up Dragon Tag for me? So Krishna is going to refresh this here, and now that there's an authorization that's been introduced, that in this scenario, again, he's an authorized user of that export license. It's going to essentially pull over a line item for that authorization that he's authorized to export against. And so all Krishna has to know is that I have ECI for this line item, and he drags and drops it in, right? And it's going to go out and it's going to look at certain aspects of this authorization and essentially apply the metadata tags that are going to be required for compliant release. Okay, so Krishna, let's let's go ahead and hit secure share here. So this is where the PEP gets engaged, right? So this is where the Axiomatics call is going to be run. Krishna has this file. Now he wants to securely share it and export it. So he's going to come in. He's going to add my information first. So go ahead. I might have frozen there, or Krishna froze. All right, so he's added my name. He's hitting validate. So when he hits this validate, it's going out to Axiomatics and it's doing a call and it's saying, okay, can Matt get access to this information? So you see it comes back, gave him a permit. I'm a US person in this scenario. Next, we're gonna try to share this with Manjula Rao, who is playing a non-US person who is not authorized in this particular scenario. So you'll see a validation that gets run here. Again, this is doing the Axiomatics call, right? It's basically saying, hey, this user requires an authorization and none's found. And finally, in this last example here, Krishna is authorized. So he's gonna hit the validation and you'll see that it comes back with, hey, this is permitted and here's essentially the authorization that it's permitted under. And again, all these decisions are being logged on the back end. So I want to still share real quick. So from here, right, this information, we hit upload secure files, this will get pushed. And it's not allowing me to share my screen. Christian, you may have to stop sharing. Okay, I'm back. All right, so now that that information is encrypted, right, it's going to leave the company. It's going to come out into Vera where it gets encrypted. I kid you not, I just had this pulled up and refreshed. So hang on a second, let me pause this and pull up my email real quick. All right, push that in there. All right, now we'll try that again. All right, so if we look at the files that have been shared here, I'm going to pull up this one. This is an ECI identification standard. You actually saw this demonstrated with our Titus config earlier today. I can come in, I can see everybody that has access to this. I can see all events that have happened against this file. And this is what becomes really cool from a trade compliance perspective, right? I can now see all the activities that are occurring against this file. And I can drill deeper down into those. I can see exactly who's doing what with these, with the files, what actions are performing, and I can, ultimately drill down very deep. So when you look at some of the recent consent agreements, hey, we're sending this information outside the company, and it's winding up being sent to China. Well, folks in China are accessing it or attempting to access, right? That'll show up within this particular log. So I'm going to show one more thing, and Krishna, I'm going to pivot. We're going to pivot back to your screen here real quick. If you'll share. And let's show the file activity report. So this is a simple report that we built. Like once we have all this information at our fingertips, what types of insights can we start to get? So Christian, let's pull in file path initially. So this is going to tell us where the information is located. We can leave that. Let's pull a file name, file path, file name. Let's pull in the ECI indicator. Let's pull in country of control. Let's pull in jurisdiction. Let's pull in classification. Oh, you got classification there. Yeah, jurisdiction, classification, right? Let's look at user. Right, and I think here we call it nationality. Let's pull nationality in to this. And then let's pull in export authorization. Right. And so what we start to see here, right, is where's our data located? What is the data? Where is it located? Who is accessing? What are they doing to it? Let's drop one more thing in here, Christian. Right after username, let's drop in action. Yeah. So all the activities that are occurring against these files, all, is the information, is the activity authorized, right? All of that is captured now in this model and in this approach with the zero trust capabilities there. So, all right, I think that right there is going to conclude our demonstration for today, and let's open up for questions.
That was great, by the way. Really appreciate that presentation, Dave and Matt. That was a lot of good content, and surprisingly enough, or not surprisingly, we got a number of good questions about this. I'm gonna try to cherry pick based on an order from what I'm seeing, because I think they're actually gonna fit really nicely together. But the first one comes from, well, I shouldn't say who it comes from. That would be terrible. That would not be a good export control scenario. Or, but one of the first questions is, we've got to see a lot of great technologies in here. Really curious, where does Axiomatics sit into that scenario? Dave or Matt, I'll pass that one to you guys.
Yeah,
Matt,
so
I'll let you start.
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
No. I was saying I'll let you start, so go for it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. So all the decisions that you were seeing, all the red light, green light decisions that were being returned, those are being automatically calculated by Axiomatics in the background, right? So Axiomatics is making all of those automated red light, green light decisions.
What we get sent is essentially an authorization request made up of attributes, any number of attributes. So it could be typically the user identity, but also the flags that come from the export control piece. So the ECI code, the jurisdictions, and so forth. And that gets set over to Axiomatics. Axiomatics contains the policies that determine whether access should be permitted or denied, and then we produce that decision, return it back to the application.
Yeah, let me, Christian, can you stop sharing for just a second? I'll pull that slide back up here.
Well, what you guys just talked about was generating a lot more interest, as there are two other questions relating to that topic. So we can dive into those in a moment.
Yeah, so from a, where does Axiomatics sit, right? So Axiomatics is going to sit here, and out in your applications where you have these transactions that need to be intercepted because they're they're ECI transactions, for example, your policy enforcement point gets embedded. And so we had a policy enforcement point embedded in the red light, green light, right? Which is going in and saying, hey, does Krishna have access, or should he have access to this stuff against the export authorizations? And we also saw it in the drag and tag example down here. Let me get off that animation so we can see it.
By the way, Matt, if you're planning on sharing your screen, we're not seeing anything.
Oh.
Sorry.
Thought I clicked.
I didn't do a very good job moderating. I apologize.
No. Well, hey, we'll take another crack at it here. So, all right. I'm trying to get this view off of here. I can move this menu. Well, nothing's going to cooperate. So essentially, right, Axiomatics, you've got a PEP sitting in here, and that PEP is calling home, right? So it's saying, hey, can these users get access to this data? That information is being sent to Axiomatics. So we've got a PEP deployed within the application, right? And then we got our policy deployment point, which is basically doing all the logic and returning the answers, right? And the PEP then enforces it back within the application, enforces that decision. So hopefully that helped answer the question.
Yeah, and for the individual who asked that question, feel free to reach out if there's any follow-up that you'd like to do. The follow-up question. So when it came to that red light, green light scenario, So obviously we were changing the attributes from India to Canada. What else had to change in that scenario? Policies, what else was happening behind the scenes, basically?
So it's essentially there was nothing else changing, right? We were just getting a different attribute about the user that was coming into the decision point, right? So the rules are set up, the authorization is what it is from an export compliance standpoint, and now the user has an attribute that is outside of what's authorized, and so Krishna's access was blocked. And then when he went back and, you know, when we swapped it back to India, he's now back in compliance with the authorization, right? And his access is re-enabled.
Beautiful. All right, and the follow-up question, this one, David, I'm going to hand off to you. But the question is, I see the value of attributes. Are we limited by the number of attributes or attribute sources that we use?
No, that's kind of a cool thing. You're not limited. You can, as long as there's a source you can connect to. It could be what I'm going to call a legacy source, like a database or an LDAP, or it could be APIs, endpoints. As long as you know how to connect to those sources, we can use them in the decision-making process. And so we're not limited to how many attributes or where they come from. And there's two ways to get attributes in the picture, right? It could either be that the decision engine realizes, oh, I need the risk score, so let me go fetch it. Or it could simply be that the application had already passed it in. Like if you had a job token, for instance, that contains claims about the user, you can totally tell the PDP, hey, the policy decision point, hey, this is Joe, and Joe's risk score is a 3, and so on and so forth. So no, the short answer is no.
Oh, that's perfect.
It's very long.
I have a feeling that is another topic that we could turn into an hour-long webinar, but for now, that was perfect. We are coming down to the last couple before we do a wrap-up. The last two are Matt Henson. You had a great list of what you called the known unknowns. Is that a list that you can share, and where can we find that information?
Yeah, for sure. We'll share this presentation after the call, and I'll probably posted the known unknowns on LinkedIn at some point. That I can share that as well. But yeah, we'll get the presentation out to everybody on the call.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. The last. This was a kind of an interesting one, and I would love to get both your takes. But this question came in as great topic, but where should we start? So Matt, maybe I'll hand it off to you, and then Dave would love to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's all based on the maturity of your organization, right? And you don't have to boil the ocean. Where you start from a prioritization perspective, well, what are the apps that are supporting the international collaboration, right? So starting there, you don't have to boil the ocean. You don't have to go out and get every piece of data tagged and all your things classified. When you start with Zero Trust, what's interesting is it actually incentivizes folks to tell you what the stuff is, to apply those tags. So within that environment, you've got safeguarding by default, because if it's not properly tagged, it's not going to be exported. So deploying those capabilities within those environments and then facilitating the object classification that's required for compliant release, right, is really sort of the first step there, right? Once the data is tagged to the right level, it can be released. You know, other aspects, it depends on your level of maturity from an identity perspective as well, right? So what attributes do you have about your users in your identity system? If you just know it's US person versus non-US person, only thing you can do is safeguard, right? Your data is not granular enough. You can't make a decision as the non-US person authorized because you don't have any of the information required for that decision. So looking at your data models, looking at your data maturity from an identity standpoint, from a classification standpoint, are good foundational starting points.
That's great. David, in a minute or less, any additional items that you'd like to add in there before we wrap and have our call to action?
I think what Matt said was perfect. I'll just add that it's simpler than you might think it is. Not you, Matt, but you, the audience. And really, when I talk to customers and they ask me where to begin, I would say start with a very well-defined application, a very well-defined use case. The application might not already exist, all the better, because you're starting greenfield. But just take a simple use case and start building from there. And then when you start thinking about the authorization piece, oftentimes the customers I've dealt with, they tend to think in RBAC and roles and groups and try to shoehorn the authorization needs into those constructs, when in fact, it's just plain old English. Just think in terms of simple attributes, something along the line. Actually, just look, in the case of export control, just look at the legislation for export control, because it is pretty straightforward. It literally says a user is a US national if they are in the US and they are a US citizen, and they can share data with another US national if they happen to be in the US, and this and that and that. It's plain old English. You don't have to try to invent a role called is US national underscore in the 50 states underscore, but not the territories or whatever it might be. You know, it's very, very simple, and keep it simple. I think that's the key to success.
That is a great takeaway to wrap on, keeping it simple. On that note, we are just up against time. Again, I want to thank David, Matt, and Krishna. Your expertise obviously shines through on every session that you guys do and talk about. Really appreciate you guys going through this. As for a wrap up, as mentioned, for any follow-up, what we would really recommend is follow the link in the chat that we've posted. That's a link to Matt Henson's calendar. He gave us strict authority to overload him with meetings over the next 6 months. Please take him up on that offer. On that note, thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.